my brother Abiola and my brother Tahaka don't feel left out, but because we are discussing matters to do with the United States of America, I'm going to particularize and centralize my two brothers and sisters from the States for the next couple of questions, if you don't mind. You know what I mean? Especially so that nobody accuses me of being an uppity Negro telling ADOS folks what to do. Right. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, in fact, I was actually told in a conversation the other day, give us support or give us silence. You know what I mean? And I'm not very good at silence, kings and queens. I'm sorry. Especially when it comes to matters like these. So, you know what I mean? We'll go forward with this. But yeah, the first thing I want to ask you is whether you identify as ADOS or not. And the reason why I'm asking you this is because it has been said that there are two components to this thing. One is the fact of being who you and what you are. So ADOS is an organic, biological or legal entity. Yes. And then the other thing is the ADOS agenda. Yes. So I'm asking you two things. Do you define yourself as an American descendant of slavery or an American descendant of slaves? Why? And are you a proponent or adherent supporter of the ADOS agenda, and why? I'll start with my sister.
No, I do not consider myself ADOS. I do not, because the issue with this is that when we say well, first of all, it's American descendant of slavery. I think it's very significant that Yvette chose American descendant of slavery instead of African descendant of slavery. That's very telling in itself. I've always been big on the fact that if we start our history in America, then we are starting our history in slavery. And when you do research on Africa, you know that before we were slaves, we actually were not. We were a free people. There were kingdoms, there were civilizations, and to completely disregard that history in favor of calling myself a descendant of slave, just on a psychological level, I think that would be very self-defeating. At the same time, the argument is that there's like you said, a legal status that you would get for calling yourself an ADOS. I think that's a silly argument. I've never heard Holocaust victims feel like they have to call themselves a descendant of the Holocaust in order to get reparations for the Holocaust. They call themselves Jews. And clearly, whenever they're looking for programs that are going to benefit people who actually went through the Holocaust, they'll specifically do the research on what, where you came from, or where your family came from. There's no need to actually call yourself a descendant of the Holocaust. This, to me, the idea of the descendant of slave is just Yvette Cornell and Antonio Moore's attempt to distance African lineage from African Americans. Mm-hmm. It's not for a legal designation. I think, and the other thing that I think is so funny is that I don't think it's controversial and anywhere in the diaspora that when it comes to slavery, that if America grants slavery reparations, that would go to people who actually descended from the slave trade. I don't think that's a controversial thing.
It's really not. I'm sorry, not to interrupt you, sis, but I keep hearing this as though people are vexed that Black Americans are about to get this big bag, of money, and so the rest of us are just vexed about it. I have not heard one individual, annoyed, disgruntled in any way, shape, or form, about the idea. Even people that have issues with how they framed reparations under the ADOS banner are not in contention with the idea that Africans in America receive reparations from the government for slavery. Not heard it, but go ahead, sis. Go ahead. Sorry.
Exactly, and that's a misconception also, because the same way that whenever I talk about things that's been done to Haiti or things that done to South Africa and Namibia, I would never expect to get a part of the reparations that those specific people are owed. So I don't think that's controversial. Mm-hmm. But to me, it's more the agenda behind ADOS, mm-hmm. the name that was created is division. There's no other reason. There's no other formidable thing that you'll get from separating us. And so I think it really more so comes from personal issues that the founders may have with the designation of calling themselves African. Unfortunately, a lot of people who have identified themselves as Pan-Afrikanists have jumped on board with calling themselves ADOS, not questioning the motivations of the people who created this designation, not questioning whether it's necessary to call yourself a descendant of a slave in order to get a reparation. And that's, you know, unfortunately, that's what happens when we don't question things, and when we don't do our research on the people who started certain movements, is that you might join something and then find out later on this is actually something done to separate you, not to join you.
Yeah, sis. I'm gonna read this this quote. This is in and around 19 minutes into the Pan-Africanism is Dead video. She says we have to define ourselves. Everybody else is defining themselves and operating in their self-interest. Pan-Africanism doesn't get us to that goal. Note that. One of the reasons why we're having this conversation is because of statements like that. Pan-Africanism does not get us to that goal. She says the one thing about the designation of African American from 1989, stick a pin, I am very interested in the fact that they use the 1989 definition of African American coming from what's name? Jesse Jackson, as opposed to the 1964-65 coming from Omowale Malcolm X. Very interested in that, yeah. But yeah, coming from 1989, the very interesting thing about that designation is that it still puts African first. It put African before American. How do you put African before American? This country defines our lives. We were born here. We ain't never been to Africa. Most of us, but we are defining ourselves by a continent and a huge landmass that we've never been to. How are we defining ourselves? What sense does this make? And I'm reading that for anybody who's telling me that the sole justification for American and the discarding of the term African is for legal constitutional purposes. What she's just defined here is entirely cultural, and entirely based upon her understanding of what is primary in the lives of Black people. Yeah. And so I'm going to come to you, my brother Omowale, in answering this question about whether you define yourself as ADOS and why.
Of course, yes, I do define myself as no, absolutely not. I don't define myself as what do they call it, an American descendant of slaves, yes. and I also do not support the agenda of ADOS. Why don't I define myself as an American descendant of slaves? You know, I think the answer is it's fairly simple. You know, I don't believe that my ancestors, were slaves, right? I think that language matters, right? My ancestors were African people who were enslaved. But I think even more the proper terminology would be my ancestors were African people who were prisoners of war, right? When you remove the slave trade outside of the context of war on Africa, right? A war that started with the Arab or Islamic trade that went across the bottom of the Sahara, that was eventually co-opted by the Jews that came out of Portugal, right? So whenever you remove any of this from the context of war, you almost strip yourself of your humanity. But in addition to that, when you say that our ancestors were slaves and don't, give them their humanity or their peoplehood, it negates the fact that there was a significant amount of resistance all along the way, right? And so for me, I choose to stand in that tradition of resistance. And similar to my sister African Esquire, I don't think that we should, if our goal is to obtain power, then we should be using an identity that gets us power. We know that one of the ways that they capture and rule over us is through divide and conquer. So why should I create an identity that divides me from the Africans who were dropped off in Jamaica, or the Africans who were dropped off in the Bahamas, or the Africans who were dropped off in Puerto Rico or Haiti or Canada? Why should I do that and call myself an American descendant of slave when I can call myself an African, and it connects me to that entire body, right? And it makes me stronger as a group, right? Marcus Garvey, another, and I try to quote Garvey as much as possible just to bring it home and help people understand the connections.
Yeah.
But he used to say that in the world of wolves,
One should go on.
One must always go on, right? And race first is our defense, no matter where we are on the planet. So I think it's important to push back, on this, imposition of this slave identity. And this is what this movement is about, the ADOS movement, and it's sad because a lot of the adherents don't really understand this, but the hope and taking on a slave identity is that you will eventually be paid out a slave dividend, i.e. a reparation within this, American empire. You will eventually be made whole as an investor in this system. And for me, I just reject that wholeheartedly, right? And no one can question, in terms of my lineage in America, patrilineal, I can get all the way back to 84, right? The Gullah people of the southern seacoast of Georgia, and then my mother's lineage, I can get all the way down to Alabama, but I don't know how far back there. But nobody can question my lineage in terms of being an African that was enslaved here, in America. But I would never call myself an American descendant of slaves. Like your ancestors would have slapped the shit out of you. So
I have to ask, because I've been told, by some very disgruntled folks that that basically that's what y'all are,